I'm so excited to introduce our panelists for the third panel for this conference, Representations of Space and Aesthetics. And we have two wonderful papers from Katrina and Greer, and I'll introduce them one at a time. So right before they present, so I'll introduce Greer, and Greer will present, and then I'll introduce Katrina, and Katrina will present, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So if you'd while you're here listening to the talks, please start thinking about things to ask our wonderful panelists. So Greer is a Wolf Undergraduate Research Fellow and a senior with a major in the history of art and a minor in comparative literature. Greer is interested in the intersection of art and politics and is also writing an honors senior thesis on early modern Netherlandish painting. Her research fellowship examines Soviet ideology around and representations of interiors and objects in the 1920s and 1960s, along with how the desire for the collective emerged in art and housing projects. Two physical and visual systems which interacted on extremely personal levels with people. Outside of the classroom, Greer enjoys playing club soccer and working as a co-editor-in-chief of Tart magazine. Great, welcome, Greer.
Thank you all for coming, and a special thank you to my advisor, Professor Kevin Platt, who really inspired this project. Okay. Can a room's corner, a kitchen device, a fabric's pattern, or a building be revolutionary? Dictate how people think, interact, and exist in the world? For the Soviet avant-garde in the years following the 1917 October Revolution, the answer was yes. They saw objects and spaces not as passive elements of life, but as active forces in shaping a new kind of person. Their modernist ideas, in combination with Marxist revolution, manifested in investments in shaping and creating both a new state and new forms of people through the material environment. This revolutionary culture, subsequently rejected under Stalinism's conservative and repressive regime in the 1930s, was recovered after his death, a revival of modernist ethos seeking to revitalize communism once again through spaces and objects. The 1920s and 60s both saw a dialectical interchange between utopian aspirations and the constraints of the actualities of unutopian Soviet institutions. My project seeks to uncover and understand the human-object relationship and representation, and the way spaces and people formed and transformed one another. In this talk today, I will discuss two thinkers, artworks, and films from both periods, but my larger project also analyzes Kazimir Malevich's Black Square, Varvara Stepanova's textiles, Alexander Rodchenko's advertisements, and El Lissitzky's manifestos. Later objects that I study include Carl Contor's treatises, works and designs from the Senate studio, propaganda posters, and Ernst Nevesky sculptures. The 1917 revolution ushered in a period of social, aesthetic, and political experimentation with profound effects on orientation towards living space and domestic objects. Radical art movements like constructivism sought to reorganize human life by rearranging spatial relationships and living space. Revolutionary thought focused intently on the control and function of objects, while attempting to eradicate bourgeois conceptions of social space, private property, and tradition. Communist theory held out the promise of a world filled with as many objects as one could need. But in classical Marxist thought, this utopian vision had been predicated on a pre-revolutionary society already capable of mass production of objects that communism could redistribute more fairly. The paradox of the Bolshevik Revolution was that Russia was not a fully formed capitalist industrial society at the time of revolution. It was a bare-bones country that grappled with pervasive scarcity. So, the society that emerged following the revolution was forced to manage the paradox of an insufficient supply, unable to redistribute properly or match growing desires for more consumer objects, desires that would only increase over the course of the coming century. Addressing one of these scarce necessities, bourgeois pre-revolutionary apartments were broken up into shared multi-family spaces called kommunalkai, which quickly became a central feature of urban life, serving as both a physical manifestation of Soviet collectivist ideology and a site where the tensions between communal living and individual identity played out. Kommunalkai arose out of sheer necessity and forced collectivism, in addition to the ideological conviction that space could forge communist morality and a new Soviet citizen. The revolutionary years of the late 19-teens and 20s brought the expression of many varieties of utopian aspirations, manifested in ideological and artistic terms. Boris Arvatov, a leading thinker, scholar, and artist, proposed that everyday material forms were the only way to resolve the historical problem of class difference and to build a proletariat society, logic exemplary of his contemporaries. Rejecting past artistic traditions, by turning to geometric forms and focusing on industrial design principles, the artistic and architectural movement of constructivism sought to become the method through which Soviet society would self-govern and collectively build a shared new world, informed by the social experience of labor and communist ideals. Art and housing projects, two physical and visual systems with which Soviet citizens distinctly interacted with in daily life, were explicitly shaped according to collectivist principles in order to create a new proletariat state and destroy the bourgeoisie. The 1915 sculpture Corner Counterrelief, created by a prominent member of the constructivist movement, Vladimir Tatlin, served as a prelude to the avant-garde 20s. This was a foundational work for the movements and artists who followed, and a manifestation of principles regarding the functionality of space and fusion of the art-life praxis. As you can see, the large suspended wall structure defies and changes a utilitarian space. It's made of industrial material. 6 cords pierce the metal block on which other thin, curving steel sheets are stacked. The cords attached to a piece of wood on the left end and are drawn together by a pulley on the right. The sculpture's materials make known their physical qualities and abilities, and its presence dissociates physical space around it. Making critical use of the 2 walls, the sculpture transforms them into materials of the artwork, merging life with art. Rather than the conventional functionalism of later art objects, the piece explodes the traditional function of sculpture and vaults it from its pedagogical place on the floor or pedestal into the lived environment. Totlin's manipulation of the corner space seems to activate traditional Russian associations. Corners house relics and icons. In the 1920s, the corner became a Soviet space for new idols not in the religious sense, but the political, portraits and texts of Soviet Marxist leaders, an apt transformation as the political became synonymous with the spiritual, while religion and the church were largely abolished according to the atheist principles of Marxism. Totlin's disruption of the corner tradition speaks to broader artistic goals of changing living spaces and the way people live in and with them. His use of industrial material as artistic object also reflects changing conceptions of the object and its relationship to society, a rejection of traditional art in favor of a materiality more closely associated with the proletariat and mass objects, therefore disrupting the existing symbolic order. Pushing these ideas further, later constructivists and productivists focus on the artist as maker rather than artist, eventually aspiring to shape utility and functionality in everyday objects at the expense of art itself. Thus, for some artists and thinkers, the artist was redefined as a social agent after the revolution. The artist became equated with the proletariat and works of art with mass-produced factory goods. The primacy of the object's materialism and its generative capacities fell away in favor of the object's utilitarian function, in service of both transforming everyday life and artistic experimentation. Okay. Perfect. Often, reconstructions of objects in space in ideological terms ran up against the realities of communal space and social life. Within the Kommunalka, citizens faced severe setbacks from the onset, and this housing crisis became linked to an identity crisis. Extreme and post-collectivism led to an obsession with minimized and individual property. Fixations with personal and spatial possessions led the interior to become a place of contestation and frustrated desire. An insecurity in the relationships between people and things emerged, wherein people were objectified and objects might be accorded supernatural, extrahuman powers or reverence. Avant-gardist revolutionary reorganization of materiality in state-imposed living formats did lead to the forging of novel relationships, yet perhaps not in accordance with the utopian visions of artists and theorists. Abram Room's 1927 film, Bed and Sofa, following the exploits of 3 young workers in Moscow, epitomizes some of the complications associated with communal apartments and relationships which develop between objects, interiors, and film. The film demonstrates the realities of communal living via a satirical analysis of workers' conditions and treatments of their home. In fact, the objects bed and sofa decide and define the characters' evolving status and relationships, as well as their sexual and romantic fortunes. Bed and Sofa begins with an interior shot, cramped and cluttered, of 2 figures asleep in a small bed, compressed into one another and spilling over its sides. This is Kola and Lydia's room, almost lavishly decorated with an ornate dining table, their section of a shared apartment loaded with objects redolent of the bourgeois social order. Volodya, a visiting worker and old friend of Kola's with nowhere to live, stops by and is invited to live with them, as they place pillows on the sofa, declaring, "The sofa is your kingdom," an interestingly, almost nostalgically feudal word choice. The camera lingers on the sofa in subsequent sequences, once a transient sleeping arrangement that has now transformed into a fully inhabited space, complete with a house cat. Eventually, Volodya introduces a disruptive presence in the home, bringing into the apartment the flagship Soviet journal, The New World, and a radio, objects of Soviet modernity that destabilize the dense, traditionally decorated space. The objects are so charged that they inform the couple's opinion of him and rework his personal aura. Lydia's presence is so disruptive, he ends the original couple's relationship by beginning an affair with Lydia. The frame on the screen depicts him, uncomfortable and disjointed, attempting to sleep on the sofa. Restless, his shoes still on, he is overwhelmed by his physical environment, the magazine and his radio headphones on the stand, and posters and photographs tacked on top of the carpet decorating the walls and disrupting the bourgeois decor. Attempts to domesticate or change the space are almost rendered futile, as the space still seems to dominate and dictate the character's fortunes. The camera never captures both the bed, on the left here, and the sofa, on the right, within the same frame, reinforcing a spatial duality in which physical objects serve as markers of distinction, carving out an imagined separation within the constraints of a single shared environment. The film's emphasis on space, objects, and the futility of transforming living space is less utopian than the visions of many avant-garde artists, but still demonstrates that the couple cannot live bourgeois lives in the collective space, and shows how living spaces and people are shaped and corrupted by objects within them, demonstrating perhaps how the socialist ideals of the avant-garde were already wearing thin by 1927. The ideological optimism of earlier thinkers and artists regarding the object rested on the collective agency rather than the agency of the object itself, yet perhaps abandoning the subject worked invertedly to tip the balance of power too far in the object's favor. Thus, materiality was imbued with a certain power, but an unnatural one, which disrupted people, almost revealing them as susceptible to manipulation at the hands of both objects and spaces. Ideologically, objects and representation might be utopian, collective, and yet with the ideals of communism coming to appear less easy to achieve than to imagine, objects began to consume subjects in mediate relationships. This film, as both art media and representation of life, depicts radical changes in consumption, as the objects themselves begin to take on agency that might have formerly been the province of the consumer. One sees the aesthetics of everyday life in film, taken down from the ideological realm of the avant-garde into life praxis. I don't have time today to tell you about the ultimate downfall of the avant-garde moment or the Stalinist era that came afterward. Instead, let's fast forward to the 1960s, often referred to as the thaw, after Stalin's death, which ushered in an era of partial liberalization, renewed utopian imagination, and revived avant-garde experimentation. In this era, too, the conflict between ideological aspirations and reality is evident. Attempts at resolving the art-life dialectic were not totally realized, and earlier complexities and constraints were amplified and modified by the politics of the thaw and awareness of global products and markets. Objects became laden with new significances. Under Stalin, capital, resources, and manpower were diverted away from consumer needs in order to intensify industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, and the efforts at war and recovery from war. In an attempt to overcome the excesses of the Stalinist era, the sense emerged in the ensuing years that communism had lost its way under his ruling regime. Many were animated by a desire to return to the utopian avant-garde experimentation of the 1920s in order to renegotiate communism. Vast new construction in the 1950s and 60s represented the material expression of de-Stalinization and the foundation of a distinctly new socialist aesthetic and way of life. In 1957, Nikita Khrushchev set out on an ambitious housing program, which sought to provide living space, revive society, and create model individuals, recalling the revolutionary spatial associations of the 1920s. In official and broadly shared theoretical discourse, housing was at the center of a new revolution of daily life. Space was once again a central tool to reforge the Soviet character, reinvigorate socialist society, and at last attain communism. Karl Kantor, an artist and thinker, directly modeled his work on the avant-garde thinker I mentioned earlier, Boris Arvatov, as he tried to formalize what Arvatov had laid out 40 years earlier, a field of sociological inquiry that would examine social relationships from the point of view of their manifestation in objects. Kantor reworked the conception of art as an engine for introducing political ideals into material reality, recalling his constructivist predecessor's obsession with the movement from art into life praxis, in support of the spiritual development of the communist collective. These principles manifested in his studio's Industrial Art of the Future production, which proposed harmony and non-alienated labor, essentially collectivity as a precondition for beauty itself. These ideological conceptions manifested in the creation of multifunctional furniture for small interiors built for the collective living spaces of Kommunalka. These included artistic items like fold-out beds, collapsible tables, and kitchen devices. The search for a new world order intersected with the task of constructivist art and architecture in reorganizing space in order to reorganize activity. Constructivism declared the material world would become the expression of communist ideology and fulfill utilitarian functions. Mikhail Chernyshov's 1961 Airplane, a bright red gouache invoking reduction of form and geometric abstraction, demonstrates the return to constructivist impulses. While not using industrial materials like Totlin, he nonetheless creates an image of modernist technological innovation, the airplane. The machine becomes a symbol of progress and a reflection of ideological aspiration and productive industrial impetus, its streamlined geometry invoking the ambition for efficiency and a streamlined society. As millions of Soviet citizens moved into newly constructed private apartments in the 1960s, official discourse juxtaposed the attitudes, values, and behavior that would ideally flourish within them in a model domestic interior. As thinkers and artists tried to reinvigorate the concept of communist morality, the state also pushed for restrained consumption and adherence to professional prescriptions in design. A functional household had no bourgeois signifiers like lace doilies, silk lampshades, or ornately carved commodes. As in the 1920s, the construction of communism remained a prominent goal throughout the Khrushchev years, and mass housing was one of the key signifiers both of post-Stalin normalization and of progressive utopian towards communism. Thus, party rhetoric promoted mass housing as an articulation of the system it was supposed to operate, while insisting on socialist rationality, household consumer goods, and prescriptions for homemaking related with the ideology of collectivism. However, many Soviet citizens still endured immense inconveniences due to the absence of basic utilities. The 1963 musical, Cherrytown, uncovers the complexities of the convoluted and corrupt Soviet apartment distribution system, while simultaneously expressing the general hopefulness and optimism of the early 60s, in which workers would emerge as victorious, upstanding citizens contributing to the realization of socialist construction in the post-Stalin era. The film whimsically revolves around the mass building campaigns of its time, applying new technologies of prefabricated building materials and industrial methods to the creation of apartment blocks in Soviet cities. The film primarily follows Boris's pursuit of Lydia, who works at the Museum for Town History and Redevelopment, a physical manifestation of both nostalgic recall and futuristic planning. Lydia and her father's shared flat collapses in an accident, and so the pair are promised a new room in the new housing development, Cherrytown. Throughout, the pursuit of love and space run in parallel. The characters equate successful relationships with the acquisition of apartments, emphasizing the obsession with spaces and flats. The musical culminates in a dramatic and satirical exposition of the power of objects, a literal magic bench. After proposing to his love interest, Sergei declares that he found the courage because of the wooden bench he was sitting on. He proclaims, "Whoever sits on the bench will be strong and courageous, and his innermost wish will be granted." For Sergei, depicted on the left, the bench dictates and mediates his romantic future, and here physically lifts him to meet his fiancée, inciting their future in a shared space. Represented in the film still on the right, moments after the proposal, other residents clamor around the bench, uttering things like, "No one can tell lies on this bench." The bench becomes the focal point and unifying item of the scene, its physical touch a marker of both moral goodness, honesty, and initiator into the collective group. The bench's fantastical nature seems to subtly nod to the magical utopian quality of visions of communism in the Khrushchev era, in which everyone would finally get their private apartment, and perhaps the vacuity of this vision. The national ideological blueprint of modernity and communism was disconnected with reality, as collectivism was failing citizens who seemed to gravitate towards a more bourgeois society of differences and abundant, perhaps unnecessary consumer goods. Quite apart from the ideological and theoretical concern with objects in communist morality and housing, art, and theory, people seem to be desiring more, engaging with consumer products along similar lines to those of the capitalist West. The frameworks which gave rise to both Soviet housing arrangements and avant-garde artistic traditions place significant emphasis on the role of objects. I've explored how similar ideological approaches informed artistic practices and transformations of living space, which were both thought to be essential sites for the creation of the new citizen. The avant-garde positioned artists, architects, and politicians under similar frameworks of material laws, which sought to abolish the subject and create the collective, while also eradicating the legacies of bourgeois culture. Kommunakai operated as a conceptual and literal new proletarian spatial organization of interiors and symbolic destruction of the individual. These phenomena all participated in the ultimate goal of articulating Soviet collectivism in the building of a distinctly Soviet person. Ultimately, social histories of the object reveal a contradiction at the heart of Soviet collectivism. While the avant-garde, neo-avant-garde, and Soviet communal living spaces sought to forge a new social order, the objects and environments meant to transform life were frequently subverted by human desire. The modernist object, intended to shape the collective, instead became a site of personal aspiration, perhaps revealing the practical limits of ideology. The tension between object and subject, collectivism and individualism, suggests that even in the most radical utopian projects, material culture often resists imposed ideals. What emerges is a narrative of objects that were not passive tools of ideology, but active participants in shaping life, yet not exactly in the manner envisioned by the creators. The two films I examine demonstrate how objects and spatial organization, meant to dissolve bourgeois individualism, paradoxically reinforced new forms of distinction and power. Rather than being neutral carriers of communist morality, objects seem to carry their own agency, resisting and reshaping ideological narratives. Perhaps then we must rethink the role of material culture in the making and unmaking of political and social orders.
Thank you so much, Greer. What a wonderful talk. I can't wait to discuss all of these with you. Next up, we have Katrina. Katrina is a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences, pursuing a degree in comparative literature with a concentration in globalization and English. She is from New Milford, New Jersey. Her academic interests include contemporary literary theory, post-colonial theory, aesthetics, and visual culture. Her project investigates contemporary online subcultures and their interaction with art, literature, media, race, and politics. On campus, Katrina is involved in the Daily Pennsylvanian, the Patch Peer Mentoring Program, and the Penn Philippine Association. Outside the classroom, she enjoys listening to music, collecting stationery, and discovering new literary magazines. Welcome, Katrina.
Hello, good afternoon. I'd just like to start by saying thank you to everyone here for coming. Thank you to the Wolf Humanities Center for supporting undergraduate humanities research, the Kislak Center for hosting us, to my advisor, Professor Julia Alexeva, who is also monitoring this current panel, and to my other fellows, whose stunning work I have been so inspired by this past school year. Oh, yes, okay. My project is titled #Aesthetic, Online Visual Subcultures and Internet Identity Aesthetics. It is chiefly concerned with a contemporary phenomenon found on social media that has transformed the keyword of aesthetics. Aesthetics is traditionally defined as a field of philosophy concerned with the subjective and sensual knowing of beauty and art, and has recently become a misnomer that many online social media users employ to describe an object, an image, or an idea that is beautiful, artistic, or generally pleasing in experience. This transformation of the word in colloquial use on the internet reveals a unique interaction by the youth with visual arts, and behind the usage are young people who identify themselves under various aesthetics. Beginning at this point of internet phenomena and observing the dissemination of this word, I ventured to ask, 1, how have the internet aesthetics shaped the creation of modern youth subculture? And 2, how can they provide insight into the ideology of 21st century visual culture in generally Western English-speaking spaces on the internet? In our society of spectacle and isolation, how have our processes of meaning-making changed, and what is the importance of image now? What do aesthetics suggest about the lamination of art and product in advertising, and what are the implications of its cycle of production and waste in the name of artistic expression? These are some of the questions I started my project with. In context of the legacy of aesthetics, we can start with the 18th century and the concept of taste. From taste, there forms then and the aesthetic, which can be understood in objects, judgments, attitudes, experiences, or values. In the effort to rationalize beauty at this era, theorists hope to provide literary criticism with a mathematical edge, often with an empirist framework. The beauty of objects are not found beautiful with reason, but rather with sense. Both judgment and discernment is needed to enjoy a proper experience of the art, and art formalism follows this model, in that a view of an artistically relevant artwork is often able to be understood through sight or sound, the senses. Aesthetic judgment maintain that judgment and taste both operate in the sensing experience and both work with general and empirical investigation. Judgment, though, is inferential and often immediate. From the early to mid-20th century, theories of attitude developed on the basis that judgment, while considered immediate, was not practical and not a practical act. Interest versus disinterest is consequential in reaction, determining the purpose and acceptance of an aesthetic sense. In terms of the experience, two modes of thought are presented: internist theories and externalist theories. One can consider the aesthetic experience to appeal to the features internal, phenomenologically, or externalist, which would match more closely to an epistemological process. The aesthetic question, or the demarcation question of current debates in aesthetics, is of their value. The virtue of aesthetic experience held in objects is argued to be found in the perceptual constraint of experience, the subjective experience, and it often follows formalist thought. For example, things like grace and unity or aesthetic gratification. One does not need to see these things for an aesthetic experience to hold value, but the value is limited by one's own perceptual constraint. So now, in a bit of a humorous contrast with that basis, I would like to share a unifying example for the audience to center the way that image culture on the internet has been observed. With the philosophy of aesthetics, I feel it is pretty apparent to see the distance between the past and now a modern colloquial definition. I want to share an example of aesthetic, its features, and some of its cultural relevance. So this is a brief description of the vaporwave aesthetic. Considered generally as a microgenre or a niche of electronic music, the vaporwave aesthetic encompasses a visual art style and a internet media type that emerged in the early 2010s and became more well-known throughout the decade. Its music is characterized by smooth jazz, lounge music, lo-fi and hi-fi electronic synth beats. Its imagery is codified in sunsets, classical sculpture, internet art, glitch art, and other cyberpunk tropes. Its surrounding subculture could be considered a satirical take on capitalism and a surrealist engagement with pop culture and entertainment. I would also like to add a general disclaimer that my work is not necessarily as an internet historian, but also because of the rapid networks and dissemination of aesthetics, it is incredibly difficult to pinpoint origin, exigence, and emergence. So depending on who you ask, all of these answers of where it came from can be different and equally correct. So yeah, I just wanted to, I pointed out some of these things, but the features could be, the classical sculpture in many of these images, text in particularly East Asian languages for whatever reason, rendered images, especially the mix of internet art as well as photography. Vaporwave aesthetic can encompass clothing, architecture encompasses mostly internet art and music, of course. That's where it started. In the past 15 years or so, with the ascent of social media, came the birth of, quote, aesthetic blogs and other various manifestations of digital forms of criticism, driving the transformation of this word. To further define it, we can describe internet aesthetics as, quote, labels applied on heterogeneous collections of materials and activities, discussed and constructed primarily on the internet. They're a form of aesthetic categorization of cultural sociology, commonly described with a single unifying term and substantiated upon a toolkit of subjectively recognizable cultural objects, such as lists or visual references, and a subjective form of meaning making. As specific cultural categories, they can be approached as a conceptualization of style, where a way of doing is associated with a recognizable creative expression as part of an overall effective style. Another approach is that of genre, where internet aesthetics are a genre of cultural object that is not limited to by medium or necessarily reinforced by any epistemological force. Internet aesthetics can be analogously understood as today's youth version of subculture, like emo, hippie, goth, however, with caveats that will later be discussed. Firstly, they work with the simulation of reality in digital spaces without physical limitation. The space that the internet aesthetics occupy differs wildly from other forms of self-expression and deal with currency and possession differently as well. Then, internet aesthetics also operate as an instant simulation of these objects, communities, and ideas. Additionally, internet aesthetics operate as a simplification of the original idea, a further abstraction of an abstraction of an abstraction. In my example, Vaporwave, what underscores aesthetic unifiers and terms is not so much the canon idea or original resource to which an aesthetic may originate. Further, they are not attached to specific texts, but rather there is a subjective experience of the text interpolated into a collective understanding of a symbol, usually a list of symbols. To understand the nature of internet aesthetics, these frameworks with which it works upon, and the ambiguity between the cultural category and genre, I believe it is important to understand the workings of the dimensions of 4 topics: space, time, image, and self. Just want a brief description of the image. So This morning, I did a search on Pinterest, which is my main source of like images. Just of the term aesthetic, this is what my algorithm came up on my account. Whatever that means, that's, I guess, me. And complete with ads as well. Oh. Thank you. So firstly, I'd like to elaborate on space. The World Wide Web as a space for internet aesthetics is an isolated space of infinite reproducibility that is both shared and individual. Space operates completely differently, as internet servers are unique internet protocol addresses with private encoded or public decoded information. The space of the internet is a neural network process that is different from other spaces because it is effectively simulation. The semiotics of conceptual space of the internet are preceded by an algorithm of platform, oftentimes mysterious and privatized, determined by the external goals of a governmental system, corporation, or any institution of power over the user. Therefore, the algorithm and the unique internet history of a user stands between them and the visage of another user or content they're interacting with. For example, websites, chats, all other platforms are interfaces where a simulation of coalescence and person-to-person relation occurs. The engagement with internet aesthetics can appear as lists, disseminated in various ways of movies, books, clothing items, accessories, activities, beliefs, and often a reference of images under one single all-encompassing interrelated premise. Intrinsically, as social communication, this can look like social media posts or videos representing these features, blog posts describing the culture of these features, as well as the real-life application of these cultural categorizations. Then I'd also like to observe time. Marlene Corcoran, in her article, Digital Transformation of Time, The Aesthetics of the Internet, for the journal Leonardo in 1996, proposes that digital culture can be discussed not only primarily in terms of space, but also in time. Quote, time waste, time spent, and yet time is the medium of all of our digital activities and constitutive of our life online, end quote. There is a shift from the consumption of digital art objects to digital art activities that demonstrate the need for the dramatic dynamism of the temporality on the internet, and also heavily characterizes the subjective experience of internet aesthetics. In her argument, Corcoran uses the example of a museum click visit to the Louvre. With an internet connection, a few minutes of generative image lag, and the 2D pixelated reproduction of an art piece, not only can an image of an artwork be reproduced on screen, but as is the experience of the museum. The barrier of entry, which, for example, for any of us as someone in America, would be a flight to Paris, time to wait in line, buying a ticket, etc. And these barriers are completely removed, and the temporal mode, which it is experienced, operates completely instant. The segmentation of time allows for a greater potential to consume information, but also changes the visual experience of the painting or museum itself, image as well. Corcoran remarks how the fascination with the artwork is no longer contained to the visual sensation of the artwork itself, but the fascination with downloading. The painting is first photographed, then uploaded, and through a process of networks is ultimately downloaded in the possession of an individual user. Within this exists a sense of control and transforms the entire experience of the painting that allows for more subjective interpretation of the painting and the museum walk in itself. Thirdly, I'd like to consider image. If a photograph or a painting on, for example, a souvenir postcard is the first step of separation between an original object and its signifier or sign, Corcoran argues that the downloading of the image in an individual possession of a user is the last step. As a side note, I'd like to argue that in this modern year, almost 2 decades later than Corcoran's work, the last step would be photo manipulation. Roland Barthes and Cameron Lucida regarded the photograph as 2 leaves, where in one, the subject and the photo, and 2, its legitimacy, the capture of the image within the frame, the memento mori, are laminated to one another. As opposed to, for example, the signature in Jacques Derrida's work as a metaphor for the loss of meaning in language, images images possess a longer sense of temporality and uniqueness than that of language. Photography allows for a degree of mechanistic control that can be exerted upon our experiences and others' experiences of the world. However, the presentation of photography inserts a certain aggression that changes our interaction with images, especially on the internet. This is a quote from Susan Sontag, who presciently observes this, quote, "Images which idealize, like most fashion and animal photography, are no less aggressive than work which makes a virtue of plainness," quote, parentheses, "like class pictures, still lives of the bleaker sort, and mugshots. There is an aggression implicit in every use of the camera," end quote. The control and exertion of power over the individual can be manipulated to not only change the image, but also the subject and the individual themselves. So with that, returning to the paradigm of self and identity leading into subculture. Although I wanted to show a connection between the formation of youth subculture groups like emo, hippie, or goth, I want to firstly start by disclaiming this notion with contemporary critique of this comparison. Internet aesthetics are debatedly distinct from the subculture, despite a similar principle of self-expression outside of mainstream monoculture. Mainstream monoculture can be defined as the dominant culture that excludes external influences. Belonging to an internet aesthetic or identifying with one is similar to that construction of traditional ideas of youth subculture. The toolkit of cultural objects, which can include clothing, music, or movies, is attached to a unifying term that summarizes the vibe or aesthetic qualities of a certain idea from which the objects are derived from, a canon, yet open and liberative set of texts manifested as an infinitely reproducible commodity. This is not so different from a modern subculture, which centralizes space or activity, for example, say a record store or a skate park, and provides a breeding ground for cultural forum, critical discussion, social bonds, community. However, the space is marked different. There is a marked difference that separates internet aesthetic communities from modern youth subcultures. The World Wide Web is an isolated space, and the community expression outside of monoculture is often politically disengaged. I also want to note, it's important to me to share, I feel like I didn't have enough time to really flesh this out, but I think it's important to note that several intersectional intricacies exist within internet aesthetics, who participates in them, who are represented by them. And they're often places and of community made by and for women, femmes, and the LGBTQIA+ community or other marginalized groups. These nuances of spaces are also demarcations of class, socioeconomic status, and social or cultural capital. Essentially, internet aesthetics are reassigners of meaning, where the cultural and artistic object are signs that create a shared symbol alongside a subjective experience. These spaces grow alongside commodity and in market products, so are applicable not only in visual expression, but in real-life activity application. Through subjective experience, internet aesthetics are aggregated and curated to infinity by the extent to which it supplicates the idea of a symbol, and then by extension, the self as a symbol. The symbolism of internet aesthetics relies somewhat in the simulation of community, but more so in the exemplification of a significant aesthetic experience. In an article published on First Monday by Guilherme Guiolo and Michael Bergman, the two researchers conducted 11 phenomenological interviews with individuals that describe themselves as, quote, internet aesthetic enthusiasts, and they determined that the goal of internet aesthetics was to become and embody a different idealized version of self. To achieve an encompassing experience characterized by aesthetic unifiers, visual, musical, and cultural objects are catered to diversify the senses and account for the multidimensionality of these activities, one's personhood, historical time periods, etc., etc. Internet aesthetics are interested in reconstructing experience where the pre-existing social meanings of signifiers are incorporated into a symbolic system where a new layer of meaning can be attributed, simulated, and subjectively experienced. This is another screen cap of a Pinterest board I made approximately November 2021. I would be a senior in high school. I guess this is the image that I thought of myself, whatever that means as well. The ambiguous, subjective, individual essence that is effectively experienced from internet aesthetics, its abstraction from the simplicity of a vibe, and this seemingly infinite reproducibility is the precipice of what configures an aesthetic. To understand the effects on people first, its potential political, racial, economical effects of image culture on the internet, I hope to reframe this ideology that underlines aesthetic experience with my four ideas of space, time, image, and self. In the future of this project, I hope to consider the intrinsic connections between online images and advertisement, object and commodity fetishism, the racial and political implication of these forms, and the creation of internet aesthetics and images through machine learning and neural networks. In observing visual culture on the internet and the entanglement of market and self in not simply just usage of social media, but in the forms of meaning we arrive at through and by our interactions with visual media, I feel like there is a gaping contradiction. Our impulse to connect to one another and express ourselves falls within an algorithm of product and possession. In reality, we are disengaged with a coalescence of identity and replaced by only a simulation. The power to imagine oneself and to see the visage of yourself in another without ambiguity and shared goals is ultimately our vie for connection. My remaining question for ourselves and for our communities is, what is real versus simulacrum? Thank you.
I'll now invite the panelists up, and I'll start us off with a brief question to both panelists, but I'll keep my remarks brief, and feel free to jump in. I'll join here. Great. So thank you both so much for you've worked so hard on these, and they're so beautiful, and I'm just so impressed also by the way that your PowerPoints also kind of like elicit what you're trying to convey in the talks. So my first question is to Greer, and the two questions are connected through kind of conceptions of ideology and use value or utilitarianism. I love your use of bread and sofa, and your use of Arvatov makes me think of the concept of width, which you've probably thought about also in other work, even if you didn't mention it. And so all of these, people in the Soviet Union who were making art were trying to break away from the way everyday life used to be, and the everyday life as something that is a burden or just kind of like endless, mindless, boring stuff. So can one, according to the thinkers and artists that you've been working with, how can life be transformed outside of this concept of the utilitarian? So you're constantly kind of thinking about how useful something is, but is there a way in which some of the artworks kind of try to break out of this concept of usefulness? For instance, my favorite work from Vladimir Tatlin is something called Letatlin or Letatlin, where it's a combination of flying and his name, and it's just a flying machine that doesn't work. But it's, we don't think it works, but the idea of a flying machine, does it have use value, or what is the use, of a flying machine, right, in 1927? And similarly, Katrina, to your wonderful presentation, and I love also, again, how you go from a kind of gray PowerPoint, and then suddenly, boom, vapor wave, and it's like exploding with color. And so I'm also interested in this usefulness, or what is the use of the aesthetics, and specifically, is there something that aesthetics can do in their preliminary research that doesn't necessarily fall prey to marketing and capitalism? Or is it inevitable that it does? Is it trying to kind of go against it being kind of useful for corporations and for advertising and things like that? So I'll let you answer, and then I'll start taking questions from others. So thank you. Thank you.
So I guess your question is one that plagued artists and thinkers that I've studied. And you definitely see that, I think, in the earlier works I've looked at, like in the black square painting that I had on the screen, and in some of Rodchenko's earlier works. And I see the use value, that like attempt of like finding use, come about later as artists try to like merge with political, and they try to like really like constructivism wants to be the method through which communism is achieved. And so I think that, like, as I've discussed, like the artist becomes social agent, and in that transformation, I think we start to see the use value in the object reemerge. Like in the textiles, it's an artistic pattern on something that is useful in everyday life. So yeah, I guess like if that answers your question, it's sort of a transformation from art into use.
Thank you. I feel like the answer, at least the most obvious thing I can think of, is just the idea of self-expression, especially for young people in living in a capitalistic world. It's very innocent to feel that the self-expression of clothing, music, though they are products, are very inherent to oneself and become very inherently attached. And I think something that I observed in my workshop actually was that there was a sense of more pro-aesthetic rather than anti, because a lot of people find it as an avenue to artistically express oneself, not only in visual clothes, movies, music, but also in activities, aligning oneself with, for an example, an aesthetic that lets them believe that going outside can have more value than what maybe traditional places of work, or aesthetics that kind of encourage them to get off the internet, which is honestly counterintuitive, but happens all the time. So I think especially in youth spaces, that would be a lot of people's first answer currently on social media.
Great. I love the immediate questions. Maybe let's start with Daphne. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentations. As I was listening, and especially just thinking about use and exchange and the social value of art and artists as agents, I couldn't help but think about all this AI generated art that, or art that we're seeing. So I'm just, especially in, talking about internet aesthetics, I was wondering if you could both talk a little bit about that, because now we're seeing this phenomenon where people are purporting to be social agents through art when it's, just copy and paste from an algorithm that's learning, especially in this idea of the reproducible virtual unreal space on the internet.
I feel like I expected this question. I feel like as an English major, you get this question from a lot of people all the time. But I think, in my opinion, so one of Marlene Corcoran's ideas was that the first step removal from an object is the image. And my theory, just like I would add on, because her work was in the 90s, the last step now would be photo manipulation. So AI, photo editing. I guess arguably AI could be even like a further step. I think for me, a lot of my thoughts, I think of it a lot more conceptually rather than like economically. I think whatever jobs, all of that stuff, like their effects, I don't understand what's going to happen necessarily with text, even with writing. But my opinion is that a lot of AI art, or not a lot, but the existence of AI art and AI images don't necessarily possess a punctum that photos and photography inherently have. A punctum would be just, I guess, defined as like a small sign of emotional vulnerability, of humanness. I think people feel that uncanny valley sense when looking at AI images online. And while there is that kind of debate of whether that gap is getting closer. You know, can you really tell? Can you not really tell? The authorship of a punctum and the way, you know, the lamination of the objectivity and the legitimacy of a photo, and the subject, and then, you know, what punctures through to the viewer, whether it's, you know, for example, it could be like a picture of someone you know, and you know that person, so you know it's a real photo. Or maybe it's a picture, the example that Barthes uses is a picture of his mother that passed away, and kind of the shine of her earring, and the way that the sun glinted, made him cry. I don't think that AI art can necessarily produce that. I personally haven't seen any AI art. I don't think anyone would say that any AI art has made them cry yet. So I think in terms of the theory that I know and my opinions of it on photography, I would just say that people really crave that punctum. People really crave something that emotionally hits them. And I'm not sure whether you can find that in AI art. So
I can't say how much AI relates to my project, but it is interesting to think about object agency, and AI and like a machine having this creative capacity and productivity, and like the sort of like completeness of the object's agency in the machine of that is AI.
Yeah, once again, great job to both of you. I think that like the sort of theoretical frameworks that both of you used to talk about objects was really, really fascinating to me as someone who thinks about kind of commodities as kind of an economic object. One of the things that I find to be an interesting commonality between what both of you are doing is you're both dealing with kind of utilitarian objects in a certain way, right? Like Greer more explicitly so, but Katrina, in terms of the Pinterest boards that you showed, a lot of it is clothing, a lot of it is I don't know how much I'd consider music necessarily, but like images of food, right? Like things that are ostensibly consumable but are still utilized in an aesthetic fashion. I guess like my question is kind of because Greer, you're an art history major and you've worked more on like formal painting in early modern Netherlandish art, and Katrina as an English and like comparative literature major for both of you. How does studying kind of utilitarian objects that are also aestheticized differ for you from studying like more formal forms of art and more formal forms of literature? And what are some of the different considerations that you've had to kind of make to explore your two projects?
I guess I'm using very similar methodology when I'm looking at these objects because they are, although they have a function, they are also art objects. So I'm still using the same like formal modes of analysis, but I guess just paying more attention to the function and I guess equal amounts of attention to the context and the maker, but just thinking like explicitly about the function and also the display, like where is the object ending up as opposed, because it's not going in a museum.
I hope I'm answering your question, but I think considering the objects, actually, I didn't really think of it in a utilitarian way before you all asked your questions, but I think objects, in whatever sense, are signs to me, and in my research, I see them as like a possession that someone owns, the affective experience that they feel towards that object, like positive, negative, how much they enjoy owning it, if it was given to them, if it was sold to them, often like connotations of like negative idea, a positive idea, and of course like aesthetic experience, like whether someone enjoys looking at it, whether someone enjoys holding it, whether it brings them joy. I think that's how I would see it, very different from an economic object.
We may be at time actually, but maybe can we do one more? Okay. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
All right, for Greer, like when you're talking about like the 1920s and the 1960s, for like there's a lot of optimism in the air, but do you think that there's a value, I guess, for like why wasn't there a continuation of this utopian art in like, you know, when we talk about Stalin or then later in the 60s, like Brezhnev era, like Soviet stagnation? Is there like a value in probably keeping that optimism alive, or is there like, is it inevitable that the time and the art match like the vibe, I guess, of the era? And I guess for Katrina, would you believe that it's like inevitable that because we're talking about this algorithm and this personalization of the internet, that this is eventually going to be like used for marketing purposes, and like eventually corporations or whatever will hint and get emotionally charged responses out of people based on specifically like the data that they collect online?
I do think there's a value in optimism. Um, but I will say, like, I guess if we're looking at art specifically, I think it was 1962, there was a show of sort of like constructivist, different, not specifically not realist art in Moscow that was visited by Khrushchev. That was sort of marked like the end of the revival of artistic practice because he really hated the show. He said like this cannot continue pretty much. So yeah, I guess like that is like sort of like a historical reason for the end of the optimism in that specific vein of art, but there's definitely a value.
Thank you for your question. To answer concisely, like definitely, something I want to look forward into my research more of how aesthetics and image culture interact with marketing. But I think everyone can agree that, you know, that the way ads are created on Instagram or TikTok, being very personable, being very targeted, really definitely goes to an emotional response. I mean, I immediately think of like Facebook and targeting specifically like elder populations, people that use social media. I think they elicit a very strong emotional response, something like a scam even. I think it's an extension of that and the way that corporations market themselves and their products online.
All right, let's thank our speakers for